Mr. Askey, will you lead us in prayer and pledge of allegiance, please, sir?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity, Lord, to be here today, Lord. Lord, we help us make good decisions for the county and the glory of your kingdom, Lord. Lord, we ask that you watch over us and guide us in this meeting. These things we ask in your name. Amen.
Call the meeting to order. Everyone is present today. All the board members are present. I appreciate the county commissioners that showed up for being here for this meeting. So that, yes. Appreciate the county commissioners being here for this meeting today. To go over what's going to have to be considered as the land use package for Gates County. Meeting agenda. Any additions to the agenda? None? Okay. The minutes from last month, everybody's got a copy of them? And has read them? Anybody have anything they want to add to them or delete from them or what have you?
Make a motion to approve the minutes.
Have a motion and a second. All those to approve the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Minutes are approved. Okay. Now we're going to have a presentation to the planning board.
Yes, we'd like to welcome Mr. Chad with the Right Planners. He's coming up to speak to us. He has a presentation to the planning board and the Board of County Commissioners concerning the type of Gates County ordinances in regard to the 160B technical updates and reamendments. So please welcome Chad with the Right Planners.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
You want me to take my mask off? I wear glasses too, and foggy glasses have been my life for the last year, so I'm very happy to take that off so you can see me. As Lisa mentioned, I'm Chad Meadows. I'm principal of CodeWright, and I have been working with your staff for the last several months on your revisions to Title 15, or at least several chapters inside Title 15, which is part of the County Code of Ordinances that deals with the development regulations. And I'm here today to present to you the work that we've done up to this point, and to talk with you a little bit more about Chapter 155, which is the zoning chapter. Okay, so we've put together what we think are a good set of revisions to several of the chapters inside Title 15. However, we're still working on zoning, and we wanted to share with this board, this body, some of our thoughts about additional revisions we'd like to make to 155 and get y'all's feedback on it. So we're going to be here for a couple hours today. If you decide that you don't want to meet that long, you just tell me and I'll go faster. If you decide that you want to keep going after 2 hours, you just tell me and we'll keep going. So can you advance? here? Oh, well, how about if I turn it this way? No? That works.
There we go.
That's great. No problem. That'll work just fine. No problem at all. You don't need to turn around. I can find the arrow. It's okay.
Can you all see?
Can everybody see the presentation? Okay, great. So like I mentioned, we're going to spend the next couple hours going over the following 7 topics. We're going to cover some of the project goals, a little bit of the background about this work and why it's been done. We'll talk about the Diagnosis Memorandum, which was something I came and presented to you guys back in August. We'll talk about the new chapter organization of Title 15, the changes that we've made, hopefully to make the document a little bit easier to follow, a little bit easier to read. I'll focus in very, very quickly on new Chapter 154, a chapter we're calling Agriculture, and why we've pulled it out to be its own chapter. That'll be a very short part of today's discussion. The majority of our time today I will want to spend on Chapter 152, which is the Subdivision Regulations chapter. So we'll cover the subdivision procedures, the standards, enforcement, some of the other elements inside the subdivision regulation. And I'll overview for you, and hopefully we can have a little bit of discussion about Chapter 155, which is the zoning chapter. Finally, we'll talk about next steps, where we go from here. So I think that we're planning on taking a short break somewhere in this presentation at your discretion. You just let me know if you want to stop, take a break, whatever, that's fine. Somewhere around 4 o'clock. I'll check in with you as we go, and if we need to stop, just let me know. We'll be glad to do that. One more thing. If you have any questions or any comments or anything that you would like to mention while we're going through, just stop me. Speak out. I don't need to get all the way through this, and then we'll have questions. If you've got questions or want to make a comment or provide some suggestions, please sing out. There are a couple places where a discussion is probably appropriate, so feel free to do that. And I'll stop at various points and ask, does anybody have any questions, etc. I want to be sure to mention to you that this is not your last bite at the apple. All ordinances in North Carolina have a formal process that you go through, that they have to follow. I'm sure you know that. This ordinance is no exception. There will need to be an official consideration of Title 15 by the Planning Board in a public meeting format, and you'll be asked to make a recommendation to the commissioners about the changes that we're proposing and their consistency with your adopted policy guidance in accordance with state law. So you'll see me again. We'll have another opportunity to talk at least once, unless you guys tell me, don't bring that guy back here. In which case, we'll find somebody else. But in any case, I just wanted to be sure that you knew that we're here to talk about this today, but this is by no means the last time we'll talk about it. There'll be another opportunity. I'm hopeful that you guys will give us some suggestions, some changes, and we can make those adjustments and be happy to tell you about those the next time we meet. Okay? Project goals. So the county issued an RFP in March of 2020 for this project, and it identified several project goals that the county was in pursuit of. Chief among them is compliance with 160D. And so what in the heck is that? You've probably heard those numbers and that letter over the past few months. 160D is the largest overhaul to the state's planning enabling legislation for development regulations, basically since Reconstruction. So this is a major deal. The General Assembly in 2019 and then amended in 20, the full gamut of planning enabling laws for all local governments in the state. So everybody, every local government, towns, cities, counties, has to go through this process, the process that you're going through right now, to amend their regulations for consistency with the 160D changes. So what did it do? It consolidated the rules for towns and counties. Right now, as you guys know, on land use matters, you're operating out of Chapter 153A of the North Carolina General Statutes, right? And towns operate out of 160A. So towns are 160A, you guys are 153A. Those sets of regulations are largely parallel, but there's subtle distinctions and differences between the two of them. And it was causing a lot of problems for applicants, a lot of problems for staffs, and a lot of problems for the attorneys. And so what the General Assembly did was, let's unify the regulations and use the same set of rules for towns versus counties, and fix all of the enabling legislation that's out there so that we can do this easier. And that's solved some of the confusion and some of the problems. There's still some other areas where things are different and even a little difficult. For example, streets, right? So counties usually aren't in the business of providing streets, transportation, et cetera. Towns and cities, they are, right? So there's a whole swath of rules that relate to streets and streets, roads that towns and cities have to deal with that you guys don't. So we still got some distinctions and things, but generally speaking, 160D brings all this together and makes a single set of regulations. There's new rules to protect applicants, vested rights, permit choice, receipt of written notices of decision, clarifications about the enforcement process, et cetera. There's a lot of new safeguards that have been put in place to protect landowners and applicants and their interests through the development review process. At the same time, there are new rules that any local government that wants to have zoning regulations, zoning control, may only do that in accordance with their adopted comprehensive plan, right? So you guys have a comprehensive plan. That's good, right? There's lots and lots of local governments in North Carolina who have zoning regulations but do not have a comprehensive plan. And on July 1st, 2022, they're going to be in big trouble if they haven't gotten a plan done, right? The state will step in and pluck away their zoning authority. So that's a big deal. It's something that's fairly progressive. There are a few states in the United States that have sort of mandatory comprehensive planning rules, and North Carolina with 160D has joined that group. So hopefully local governments will have more effective development regulations that have a future focus, and we're able to think about how we're planning for the future, et cetera. And that's one of the things that 160D does, is help make sure that that happens. So 160D, we needed to comply with it. That was probably the banner reason why Gates County embarked on this project in the first place, but it's not the only reason. There's a handful of other ones that are also important. You guys well know there's been a series of text amendments that have been done. A couple recently are the temporary housing one that was done in July of 2020, the outdoor shooting range stuff that came in 2019. So there's always text amendments that are coming along, and those need to be integrated into your development regulations. So as part of this process, we'll pick those up and integrate them with the rest of the regulations. If you read the RFP, you probably didn't, but if you did, you'd see that the county is looking to remove a lot of vague provisions and repetition. And I know that you guys know that your development regulations have a lot of needless repetition in them, where the same information is repeated over and over and over in various parts of the document. That's typically thought of as a bad practice. And the reason why that is so is over time, your regulations change through the amendment process. If you have text that's repeated but subtly differs over time because one section was modified but you forgot a different section, or you made one change here and didn't check the other section, over time you get inconsistency that creeps into the language, and that's very dangerous. It's very dangerous legally. It creates legal exposure for the county. We don't want that. It's very confusing for the staff and creates possibility for them to misinterpret the rules. We don't want that. And it's very confusing for applicants because they're not sure exactly what the rules are that they need to follow. And we absolutely don't want that either. So fixing these vague provisions and repetition is something that's really, really important in this process. And it's one of the things that you'll see when we start getting into this material. I am a huge believer in saying something just once instead of having to repeat it multiple times in your language. So you'll see that. I'll give you another example of what I mean here. So you guys have in your current Code of Ordinances in Title 15, you have Chapter 154. Are you familiar with it? The County Development Standards. Yes? No? Those were written before, I think they were written before you had zoning regulations. Then Chapter 155 was adopted, but the county never rescinded 154. So you've got parallel language in 154 that talks about how sites need to be configured and how development needs to take place, okay? But that information is obsolete because of what's in Chapter 155. And that's a great example of why every so often you need to go through your ordinances and clean them up and get rid of the old, out with the old and in with the new. So Chapter 154, County Development Standards, are one of the chapters that will go away as part of this process and be replaced with new provisions. And I'll talk more about that in a few slides. So we had 160, and that was important to fix, but there's other things too, right? The General Assembly is a very busy bunch of folks, and they've been making changes to rules affecting county governments across the state for a long time, and if your rules aren't keeping up with them, then you're out of consistency, you're out of compliance with state law. And my guess is you probably have not been making annual changes to your development regulations to keep up with the General Assembly. So there are lots and lots of provisions out there that have changed that you need to address, okay? For example, performance guarantees, all right? So if somebody wants to do a subdivision and maybe bond a street or bond some other kind of infrastructure, you guys have some provisions in place about how that's done. What's allowable, how long it can be done for, the amount, the process associated with it. Well, guess what? Those rules have all changed, and your regulations need to change with them, right? So fixing your performance guarantees is an example of other state laws, don't have anything to do with 160D, but that we needed to change. Now, the same thing's going on in the federal government, right? They've got Congress, and they're making rules and changes all the time, too, okay? So one of those changes is actually titled the 2017 Tax Relief Act. And inside this act has a bunch of rules about telecommunication facilities and how local governments are or are not allowed to regulate those kinds of facilities. Everybody has a cell phone now. In fact, cell phones are vital to emergency service provision and emergency communication, right? So now, what used to be sort of a luxury or something that maybe people didn't take advantage of is now a vital part of the infrastructure, and the federal government has seen fit to step in and preempt local governments from regulating much of that telecommunication infrastructure, okay? So your provisions need to reflect the rules that have come down from the federal government. So, you know, I'd love to tell you that it's just the state and the feds, but there's other things we need to deal with too, like court precedent, right? We've got superior courts and appeals courts, and they're all making decisions, and things are happening with respect to planning laws, et cetera. The very important case came up in the Court of Appeals called Byrd versus Franklin County. And this has been about 8 or 9 years now, that dealt with unlisted uses. And basically the gist of the case was, it is no longer acceptable for a set of development regulations to simply say if a use isn't listed, it's not allowed, okay? That thinking, which exists in your current regulation, isn't supported by case law here in North Carolina. And it's necessary to make changes to your rules so that you're consistent with the case law that exists. And we're going to talk about that in way more detail than you probably ever wanted to, but not today. So just for your information, states are changes, federal changes, courts are doing things. We need to come into compliance with all that, okay? We also obviously want to clarify.
I got a question.
Please, please.
Going back to cell towers,
Yes.
okay? The possibility of putting up cell towers in the county and then no antennas being put upon them, which means they're not being used.
Right.
Is there any regulation on that?
So your question is, can you limit or control the placement of cell towers on a speculative basis? I'm a landowner. I'm thinking maybe I'd like to make some rent off of some of that vertical real estate by putting up a tower. Can you control it? You can control where towers are located. You should control where towers are located, and I would suggest to you that you consider a path of least resistance. In other words, find places in the county where you think it's most appropriate to have a new cell tower and make that easy to do, okay? Find other portions in the county where you don't think cell towers are appropriate, right? And make that difficult, if not impossible to do, all right? And that's solely within your police power. You have the authority to do that, at least with respect to cell towers themselves. Now, there's new technology and there's new things happening that aren't cell towers, though they do provide wireless communication signals, and your ability to regulate those has been preempted, and we'll talk about that when we come to that part of it. But cell towers, can you control them? Yes, and you should. Speculative towers aren't good for your community, and I'll let you in on a little secret. In 10 or 15, maybe 20 years at the outside, we're not going to need cell towers anymore because there'll be some other stuff that's going to be taking the place of that. So the future for these tall 300-foot towers is going away. They'll still be out there for radio. They'll still be out there for TV to some extent. But the cellular use of tall structures, changing. And it will change quite a bit. Great question, though. Okay, so I'll just finish up and say, we want to incorporate best practices into your regulation, right? We want to look forward. We want to position you guys so that the regulations that you have in place are going to sort of help you through the next couple of decades, right? Because you don't really do an overhaul like this every year. This is something that happens once a decade, maybe once every 2 decades. I have lots of clients, it's been 50 or 60 years since they've overhauled their regulations. So not something you do every day. We want to get in the best practices that are in place for you now so that your rules are in pretty good shape to take you for the next few decades. So best practices, like an intuitive document structure, right? I can find my way through it fairly easily. Removing repetition, we talked about that. Making sure that all the criteria that this body uses or that staff uses for making a decision is set down in the document so that it's very clear when we're making a decision about an application, these are the criteria that we'll be using to judge your application. Clarifying who makes a decision on an application and what time they make that decision. Ensuring that the applicants understand what's required for the application, what's required if they want to make a modification to the application. How does that work, and being very clear about that is important. The goal, obviously, is to make it all as predictable as possible. Predictable for the applicant, predictable for the neighbors, predictable for the staff, predictable for you, okay?
And it'd be the same throughout the state, just about, correct?
Well, there's a lot of variation. The 160D does bring some consistency to some of the procedurals. The steps that you take in the process of considering an application are uniform in a lot of ways. The criteria that you use in deciding an application, that's up to you. So you do have some autonomy there, and that's a good thing. But the process that you'll use is becoming more and more consistent across the state. Any questions on project goals? These are the things that are really guiding myself, staff, as we're working on your regulation. So we're really trying to keep all these things in mind. Any questions? Okay. I mentioned earlier I came out in August and gave you guys a brief overview of the Diagnosis Memorandum. The best way to think about this is it's sort of like the roadmap for the project. It sets down for you the changes that we think we're going to make in the document based on what we've read, what we've heard. In July, I spent some time talking. I talked to staff. I talked to your county manager. Talked with you about, your thoughts about the regulations. And I spent some time analyzing Title 15. And the result is this Diagnosis Memorandum, which came out in early August. So basically, we assessed 4 of the 5 chapters in Title 15. All right, so we looked at 151, okay, and I'll tell you, you'll see what these mean in a second, through 155. And we tried to set it up so that we provided you with a set of recommendations that you must make for consistency with 160D or other state or federal law changes. So there was a table for each one of those chapters, 151, 154, 155, etc. Each chapter had a table, and the table had 2 parts. The first part was the requirements, the recommendations that you needed to make for legal compliance, okay? Which is good, and you need that. But there's also a second part to each table. In this slide, it's the part that's kind of in green down at the bottom of the second page, the page on the right. Those are recommended changes, things that you don't have to change for compliance with the law, but that you might want to change for consistency with best practice, or staying current or modern, or addressing issues that came up either in discussions with your staff or through our review of the document. Okay, so again, recommendations, don't have to take them. Not going to hurt my feelings if you say, Chad, that's a terrible idea, I don't want to do that. No problem. They're just out here as food for thought for you. So like I mentioned, I overviewed this memo with you on the 18th of August. Your staff and I then discussed the optional recommendations for subdivision and zoning shortly thereafter. And that memo and the presentation I made and the discussions that we have form the basis for the changes to Title 15 that I'm here to talk to you about today. All right? So questions about the Diagnosis Memorandum? Okay, I know I'm going slow and kind of easing into this. I just didn't want you guys to think that I was like shooting from the hip and that I said, hey, here's a great idea, let's just throw this in there. This is a very methodical process and we take our time so that we get it done right. Okay. Chapter organization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of 30,000 foot issues, and then we're going to kind of zoom in on the individual chapters. So let's talk about chapter organization. I said at the beginning that documents need to be intuitive, right? They need to have intuitive chapter titles. It needs to make sense. The material that's in the chapter needs to be clear. And it's often helpful when you take material that's similar and put it with the other material that's like it. It's called putting like material together, right? So I have all the procedures in one place, and all the districts in one place, and all the standards in one place, instead of sprinkling it out throughout the whole document where I have to turn a bunch of pages to try to find what I'm looking for, right? So the image on the left side of your screen is current Title 15. The image on the right is the proposed chapter sequence in the draft Title 15 that we're working on now. And so what you'll see are a couple of sections. Chapter 152 and 154 are circled. We are suggesting those go away. We would like to pick up the manufactured home provisions that have their own chapter. Assumedly, it was in place before you guys had a countywide zoning ordinance. It deals just with manufactured home and manufactured home parks, and pick up that material and locate it in the zoning ordinance where it belongs, okay? Because that's where that material needs to be. Why? Because mobile homes and mobile home parks are uses that are allowed in specific districts following very clear specific procedures that are set down in your zoning ordinance, okay? So we suggest that that be done, that you pick up that material and put it where it belongs, your zoning provisions. As far as the county development standards, I mentioned earlier that these seem to, and I'm going out on a limb, you guys who have been here for a long time probably know better than me, but I will tell you that in looking at Chapter 154, it looks to me like those were very generic site configuration standards that were put together at some point before you had a zoning ordinance. They deal generally with how sites need to be configured and give very generalized information about how development needs to take place in the county, which is great. However, you have much more detailed, much more specific, and much more relevant information in your current zoning ordinance already that makes Chapter 154 obsolete. There is no reason to keep it. In fact, it could create legal jeopardy for you. An applicant could say, hey, I'm following Chapter 154. I did just what it says, right? But in fact, Chapter 155 has different rules that are more detailed and more specific. Which one am I supposed to follow? Well, it's not clear. Okay, so suggest to you that we take 154 and we roll it into zoning like we did with the manufactured home provisions. Again, in pursuit of predictability, clarity, and ease of use. Okay? So slightly different chapter structure. Okay. We also changed the page layout. You see a couple of images on the left-hand side of the screen. There's sort of a picture in the back. That's what your current text looks like on the page. Okay? Can everybody see that? Then there's a picture in front of that that's got some heavy black lines in it. That's what the draft language looks like, okay? So we've done some things to the standards themselves. We've created a numbering system, all right? Your current regulations, can everybody see? You guys have these fancy monitors, and but the sun's coming in, so yeah.
Everybody good?
Everybody good? Okay. You needed a new numbering system. Your current regulation has these things that I guess are divisions in the text, okay? So in a chapter you have, placeholders, sections, and it's organized, right? It's very, very helpful to make sure that all of your chapter divisions are numbered, okay? So that you can go from one to the next, or search and find pieces inside the text. Your current regulations have divisions in them that are not numbered. It's probably hard to see, but if you look at the screen, there's a picture of your current regulation, and it has the words introductory provisions. There's no number, right? So I don't know if that's the first subsection in that article, the last subsection. I have no way of knowing, okay? So we created a new numbering system. Every section inside your document is numbered, okay? So that was an important change that we're making. We also changed the page layout. We wanted to make sure that you weren't wasting space on the page, right? So the text is a little bit tighter. You don't have as much blank space between major sections, okay? We've added footers down at the bottom of the page that have the article number and the page number there, so you can open the book and see, hey, I'm in chapter 152, I'm in chapter 155 instantly, okay? So that's an important change. We've added additional detail. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right now, but I'll just suffice it to say that we took the regulations that you guys had, we carried them forward, and then we supplemented them with things that we needed to do for 160D or that we thought were important based on the recommended changes in the Diagnosis Memorandum. Okay? So you've got more detail now in this draft regulation than what you have in your current regulation. Okay? Any questions about this kind of 30,000-foot stuff? So new chapter sequence and new page layout. Okay? All focused on trying to make things a little bit easier. I know it's different and maybe a little foreign. Hopefully it'll get good to you. Just give it a shot.
Making good sense.
Okay. If it's not, then we can make some changes. One of the things that I always tell folks, and I mean it, this isn't my code. I've done a lot of these, and this isn't my code. It's your code. And it needs to be what you want it to be, not what I think it should be. Now, as long as it's legal, as long as it's enforceable, and as long as it's easily administered, then we're good, right? And I'll make those changes. But if you suggest to me, hey, Chad, I don't like the way you've done this, or we want to change that, then you just let me know, and we'll make those changes, okay? So as long as we stay legal and we stay easy to use, I'm right there with you. I'm not married to this, it's your code, okay? So just want to be sure that I drive that point home to you, because you guys are going to be the ones administering it. You, Lisa, other staff members. It's got to be a document that works for you. So that's kind of the end of the 30,000-foot stuff. We talked about the goals, right? Remember, we talked about the Diagnosis Memorandum, right? The precursor to this. We talked about the structure of the new document, and we talked about the page layout. So now I'm starting to get into the individual chapter material that's important for us to focus on. We're really going to spend the most of the day talking about chapter 152, the subdivision regulations, but I want to kind of get one thing out of the way before we do that, which is chapter 154, okay? Which I've called agriculture. Now, maybe you like the title, maybe you don't. Certainly we can make some changes to it. Essentially, chapter 154 is, we've relocated some of the standards that are in your current zoning ordinance that pertain to your agricultural advisory board and your voluntary and enhanced voluntary agricultural districts, okay? That material is unique, it's highly specialized, and it's focused on folks who own property who want to put their property into an agricultural district for purposes of taxation or for purposes of protection, okay? It has not a whole lot to do with the development regulations per se. It's about farms, yes. It's about land that's being farmed, yes. It's a district, yes. But land that's inside a voluntary agricultural district or an enhanced agricultural district is intended to remain under farm use, right? It's not intended to enter the development process where we would use subdivision regulations or where we would use zoning regulations, all right? So that's one reason why we might want to pull that language up and put it in a different location. And so we're suggesting, remember Chapter 154, the county development standards, those obsolete provisions that were around before you had a zoning ordinance? Basically what I'm suggesting is we grab that chapter Chapter 154, and we use it to hold these agricultural provisions, specifically the Agricultural Advisory Board and those two voluntary agricultural districts, okay? There's no changes to the law. We didn't make any changes to the text that's in there. We did adjust some of the cross-references, okay? And you'll see that in the redlined version of the document if you're interested in seeing the tracked changes version where we've made the changes, or it used to say 153A 380 and now it says 160D 908. You know, that is available for you. Staff has that and can share that with you. So I did make some minor adjustments to the language from section 155.048, fixing cross-references. But that was the only change that was made. We picked it up, we put it in this different chapter, and we updated the cross-references, okay? So I just wanted to knock this chapter out so that we could dispense with it. If you guys have further questions about it or suggestions, or you want to talk about it more, we're happy to do that. But essentially, this was one of those things that, you know, just really wasn't super important for 160D, wasn't super important for the development regulations. We wanted to pick it up and put it in this location. How do people feel about that? So, worried?
May I just add one thing?
Please.
Just to help ease everyone's mind, it has been forwarded to Matt Lowe. He has gotten all this information, just to let you know, because they have it on board, and so I have already forwarded that to him, and they are gonna take care of that. I think there may be something that, I think we talked about, the board commissioners may have to adopt that change.
Yes.
And that's it, but it has been taken care of.
Right.
So that's just.
Assuming everybody's comfortable with it. They're comfortable with it, you're comfortable with it, and the commissioners are comfortable. This isn't what I would call a significant change, which is why there's only one slide on it, and we're dispensing with it in 3 minutes, because this is kind of small potatoes for us. So, any questions on the Chapter 154?
When land's put into this, chapter 154, can it be taken back out?
Sure, absolutely. This document lives and breathes, and you know, if staff or you or your elected officials want to change your development regulations, they may do that. You want to be sure whenever you're changing your development regulations, make sure that your attorney is on board, make sure they're comfortable with it, because they're the ones who are going to be defending you, you know, in the court of law, so they need to be comfortable. But these documents are intended to change over time. You never just set it and forget it. It's something that you always have to kind of work with. Good question. Okay, so we're going to talk about 155, the zoning chapter as well, but before we do, let's talk about the subdivision regulations. So, deep breath. This will be the majority of what we cover. It is about 3:40 right now, so I figure we might get maybe halfway through this. If you guys want to stop halfway through, you'd let me know. If not, we'll just keep on trucking. So, all right. Okay. Chapter 152, the subdivision regulations. So this slide shows the proposed 6 articles. On the left-hand side of the screen, down that column, you see 152.1, administration, 152.2, procedures, etc., and on down the page. On the right-hand side, you see a bunch of section numbers. Those are section numbers from your current Chapter 152, okay? So what this chart does is explain how the current sections have been shuffled into a new sort of article sequence inside of Chapter 152, okay? So what are the highlights? Well, you have 10 articles in your current Chapter 152. Again, none of them are numbered, but they've been reduced from 10 to 6, okay? And these are the 6: administration, procedures, standards, infrastructure, enforcement, and definitions, okay? We have grouped the material by topic, okay? So all of the procedures are together in the procedures section. All of the standards are in the standards section, etc. The enforcement article is new. You do have some current enforcement provisions, 2 paragraphs. You need more than 2 paragraphs. So we have spent some time, and I'll talk about this in a few seconds, the changes that we've made to the enforcements chapter. But there have been some pretty dramatic changes there. Okay, so that is our Chapter 152 structure. We've tried to simplify the articles, we've tried to group the material together, and we've made some updates, okay? Six articles in Chapter 152. The first of those is the administration article, okay? This is the boilerplate. It's the owner's manual, if you like. It contains the title, the effective date, the jurisdiction provisions, what is subject to it, what's exempt from it, how do we handle conflict, etc. So these are the key sections inside of Article 152.1. It is your lucky day because I am not going to talk about each and every one of those. I am going to talk a little bit about the green ones. Okay, so the green text that you see, can you guys see the green text, the blue text, greenish blue? I want to talk about that because that's new stuff. That stuff is there largely because of 160D. Okay, so these are things that we need to have in our regulation based on changes. As I mentioned before, so the black text is what you've got now. That might have been tweaked a little bit, but it's generally the way that it was. The green text is new sections, and as I mentioned before, there is a tracked change version if you're one of those detail folks who really wants to get into what changes did these guys make and where and why. That information is in the tracked change version of the document. So I can't. If you want to see what that might look like, you guys can just kind of look at it at your leisure and pass it on down. That's what it looks like. Some people like it. Most people find it more confusing because it's a lot, right? It's all of the text in your current regulation plus the stuff I've added, and it's 6 different colors, and there's underlines, and there's bells and whistles and all kinds of crazy things. But it's there for you if you want to see it. And you can easily decipher what changed. So let's talk about the green items, right? There's things in there that are green. Effective date. What is the date that the subdivision regulations are adopted? Very important because there are changes in permit choice law now. Permit choice protects the applicant from any changes in development regulations, okay? And it's necessary to know the date from which the regulations have been made effective so that an applicant, you, an attorney, a judge, can know what are the dates that are involved here when the regulation change. So it's necessary to identify the effective date of the regulation, okay? Exemptions. What are those things that are not subject to our subdivision regulation, okay? And so the state's very, very clear about this, right? And you guys are very well aware, I'm sure, that there are a variety of subdivisions that can be done here in North Carolina that local governments don't have any control to regulate. For example, subdivisions where all the lots are larger than 10 acres and it's intended for residential use and there's no extension of utilities or roadways, okay? Guess what? There's no control. The county has no control over those kinds of subdivisions, all right? Subdivisions that are done as part of private cemeteries, no control. Subdivisions that are done as part of intestate succession or a will through the courts, through probate court, not in the county's control, okay? And there's a handful of others, all right? And they're listed in this exemption section. It's very important to note which subdivisions are subject to versus which subdivisions are not subject to these regulations. Now, you guys know there's probably farmers in here, and I understand how, agriculture is extremely important to North Carolina. It is our #1 industry by far. Farmers will tell you bona fide farms are exempt from zoning control in North Carolina, and that's absolutely a true statement. It is absolutely true that bona fide farms are exempt from zoning regulations, okay? However, bona fide farms are not exempt from subdivision regulations, okay? So even if you own a farm and you want to divide land on your farm, if that division meets one of the subdivision requirements that are subject to subdivision law by the state, then the county needs to review that subdivision. And so that's something that trips people up sometimes. It's easy to think, oh, well, farms are just exempt from local land use control. That is not true.
Explain what you meant when you said bona fide.
So a bona fide farm is one that passes a test, and the test is set down by the state, okay? And it is usually, it's taxed at present use value, okay? That's usually the test of a bona fide farm. However, there are some other things that are out there that rise to the level of bona fide farm status, but might not be taxed at present use value. For example, forestry, okay? If I'm conducting forestry in accordance with a forestry management plan, then I can enjoy that same bona fide farm exemption, even though I might not be growing vegetables, okay? Mariculture, right? And I'm not going to go through all of them because there's a big long list, but mariculture where I'm like growing fish, right? Or I'm growing shrimp, or I'm growing something like that. That is considered to be a bona fide farm use, as long as it's done in accordance with state law. So there's a handful of things that are out there that can enjoy that bona fide farm exemption, all right? And it's the state who gets to decide which is or isn't, what does or does not meet that bona fide farm exemption. We need to be aware of it. We need to regulate based on what the state law is. But I just wanted to clarify for you, because I've heard so many people say, well, farms are just exempt from local control. Not true. Not true at all. So the exemption and applicability sections inside your subdivision regulation will clarify that for everybody, okay? Let's see, what are some of the other sections? Relationship to other laws and policies. So there are in existence now today, some of your subdivisions have covenants, deed restrictions, other private agreements, okay? And that's good. You need that. In fact, there are some parts of your current subdivision regulation that deal with homeowner associations that say you've got to have covenants. And the covenants have to clarify that you can tax your residents so that you can pay for these common facilities, okay? Now that's an example of a private agreement that exists between multiple property owners. The county does not enforce private agreements. The county does not enforce covenants, okay? That's not your job. If somebody has an agreement with the county, then that is your job, but private agreements between individual landowners is not something you get involved in, okay? Clarifying which sort of agreements are versus are not subject to these standards is what section 152.108 does, okay? Transitional provisions. Okay, so we started this process, gosh, back in March, or I got underway in June. We've been working on it. I suspect you guys are still taking applications, and business as usual is sort of going on, right? People are still filing applications, all right? The point is that we didn't just shut down business because we're working on getting this ordinance adopted, all right? So at some point, when you adopt Title 15 and these subdivision regulations, there's going to be applications in various stages of the process. Some will be submitted but not reviewed. Some will be reviewed but not decided. Some will be decided but haven't been started. Some have been started but not finished. What do? How do we handle those applications that are already in process on the effective date of these new regulations? That's what the transitional provisions do. They clarify how we handle open applications, existing violations, existing nonconformities, etc. So all of that information is bound up inside the transitional provisions section. Okay? Vested rights. This is a very, very confusing, litigious, awful subject, but it's also very, very important. Vested rights protect applicants from changes in the law, all right? As this body, elected officials, change your development regulations, right? Applicants who are out there with development in process, the rules change. Which set of rules do I have to follow? What happens if the changes that have been approved make my development unlawful? How's that handled? That's not fair. Vested rights protects those applicants, okay? Chapter 160D has 6 or 7 pages on vested rights, okay? There are now differential time periods associated with an approval embedded in state law, okay, that say once Gates County makes this approval of this kind of application, that approval is protected from any change in the law for a specified amount of time based on the type of application that it is. For example, building permit protected from law changes for 6 months. Okay, once I get my building permit, I can go out there and I can do whatever I want. The laws can change however much you want them to, but I get to go under what the laws were in place when I was approved for a period of 6 months. Okay? All other types of development applications like site plans, okay, they're good for a year. All right? Then we have these things called site-specific vesting plans, all right, which might be a special use permit, or it might be a conditional rezoning, or it might be something like that. That's vested for 2 years, but can be increased to 5 years, depending upon whether or not I ask the elected officials for a longer time period, all right? Then there's the multi-phase development, which is vested for 7 years. Then there's the master plan development, the development agreement kind of application, which is for a big multi-year complex thing, which is vested as long as the contract between the county and the applicant says it's vested for. So suffice it to say, there are 6 or 7 different flavors of vesting. It's extremely complicated. It's also extremely important. The vesting provisions identify for you and for the applicant what the rules of the game are with respect to how long their approval is protected from changes in the law. Okay? So that's an important part of 160D. It is set down here.
Question for you.
Please.
On that. What's the difference between that and the grandfather clause?
Very, very good question. So a grandfather clause protects existing development and allows it to be maintained. Okay, so I can have it. So let's take a real world example, right? So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I have an apartment building in a single family residential district, and it got approved before it became a single family residential district. So it used to be that I could have that apartment building there, then the rules changed and I can't have it anymore. All right, so no new apartment buildings. But I was there before the rule changed. Right? So I'm grandfathered, which means I can stay, all right? It means I can stay, it means I can maintain, all right? But what I can't do is whatever the rules say with respect to my non-conforming use, right? So I can't enlarge my multifamily structure. If my multifamily structure burns down, right, how much, depending upon how much it's damaged, I may or may not be able to reestablish it. So grandfathering deals with development that's in place, okay? Vesting deals with applications. Vesting deals with approvals, not necessarily existing development, though it is a gray line, and it is kind of confusing. I get that. We will be talking about both vested development and nonconformities because we need to treat them both, okay? Good question.
Under the grandfather thing, take that scenario you just used.
Sure.
As far as the building there.
Mm-hmm.
If the person was to sell it to another person, then it's not, is it still grandfathered in?
Absolutely. It absolutely is. And 160D made it clear that that kind of issue, that nonconformity, that the right to continue that nonconformity rides with the land, not with the person, okay? So that could be sold, change hands, whatever.
It burns down, he can build it back.
Not necessarily. It depends on what the grandfather rules in place say. And you guys get to decide what those rules are, okay? Now, ownership is one thing, use is something else, right? And I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole because this is really more of a zoning issue, but let's talk about it just for a second. Multifamily building, all right? I sell it to you, all right? It was non-conforming when I owned it. I sold it to you. You can still maintain it. You can still keep it. It's still non-conforming. What you can't do is change it from a multifamily building to a hotel, all right? If that hotel's not allowed in that district, you don't have a right to change that non-conforming use into another non-conforming use. That's not allowed, okay? Does that make sense? Yeah. We're going to cover this non-conforming stuff in the zoning chapter in a lot of detail. Uses, structures, lots, signs, sites. Okay? Everybody with me? You guys hanging in? Okay. One more thing, I'll just talk about it for a second. That's the review authorities, okay? So that's you guys. You're a review authority. Board of Commissioners, also a review authority. Staff is a review authority. Board of Adjustment is a review authority. We're also suggesting a greater recognition of a technical review committee as a review authority. And this is important. I want to be sure that you guys understand this. 160D has made changes. And here are the most important ones for you. One, every person who sits on this board needs to be administered an oath, okay? It comes from the state constitution, and you are to recite it in public before you take office. And that's true for staff. It's true for every review authority person who is involved in decision-making in Gates County. Okay, so that's one. Two, there are very, very specific conflicts of interest standards that are in place that deal with whether or not you are in a position, you or a family member are in a position to financially be impacted by the decision. Okay, if you stand to gain by a decision that you are a review authority on, you must recuse yourself. You must. You don't really have to, but if you get caught and you get sued, you'll lose, and then you'll owe somebody a bunch of money. So you need to recuse yourself if there is that conflict of interest, if there is potential financial gain for you, all right? But there are also some other standards about the applicant's right to an impartial decision maker, okay? So set down in these review authority standards are the rules about conflict of interest for you as a body, and everybody needs to be aware of those. Finally, your rules of procedure, the rules that you follow when you're sitting at the dais and you're conducting public meetings or public hearings, okay? Those rules need to be set down. They need to be available for anyone from the public to come in and inspect. Okay, so you have to be clear about, here's where we keep our rules of procedure, this is the person who's in charge of keeping them updated, and this is how you may get a copy of them. All right, so those are 3 rules that are new that you guys need to be taken care of, and that's set down in that review authority stuff with the similar sets of rules for the other review authorities that are out there. Okay? All right. Okay. This is a very important slide. They're all important, but this one is very important. This is on page 152-11 of your code if you have any trouble seeing the screen. This is the summary procedure table for the subdivision chapter, all right? And what it does is it sets down the, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the 8 different types of procedures addressed in the subdivision article, or subdivision chapter rather. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 review authorities who have some role in the consideration of an application, okay? So take, for example, the first row, which is exempt subdivision, okay? So when I look at the exempt subdivision, I see that there's a D under the subdivision administrator. That means that the subdivision administrator decides applications for an exempt subdivision. There's an A under Superior Court. That means the Superior Court hears any appeals of the subdivision administrator's decision on whether or not a subdivision is exempt from these rules, okay? Now, the very first column has this thing called a pre-application conference. This is something that's new. We're suggesting it be added. You guys have a sketch plan system in place now. It operates just like a pre-application conference. Maybe a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. It certainly requires the applicant to lay down a ton of capital before he knows or she knows whether or not their application is going to be approved. So we would suggest a pre-application conference, which is a little bit more fair in terms of having to put down a bunch of money up front for an applicant. Still gives you the same amount of information, still gives you the same level of comfort about what's being proposed, but does it in a way that's less expensive for the applicant. So suggest that you guys consider the pre-application conference. Anyway, as you look at the table, you see there's 7, 8 different types of subdivision procedures, and you see that all of the cells under the various review authorities have an R or a D or an A. Okay, so you know who's making what decision at what time. Recommendations happen before decisions, appeals happen after decisions. Okay? So let's talk about this. Some of the embedded in this table, and it's going to be something that you'll want to study maybe now, maybe later, but there's a lot of information here for you to keep in mind. First, I mentioned the pre-application conference. It's mandatory for some types of applications. It's optional for others. Okay, so if you've got a mandatory pre-application conference requirement that for your type of subdivision, guess what? We're not going to allow you to file an application until you've done your pre-application conference. And that's going to, the importance of that will come in a couple of minutes, but that's important. I want to talk about the courtesy subdivision, the exempt subdivision review procedure. Okay, so at the head of the head of this discussion on this article, I said there's a handful of subdivisions that are exempt from our laws, right? You remember that? The things that are larger than 10 acres, or things that are part of a family cemetery, or part of a intestate succession, etc. There's a handful of subdivisions that are out there that are exempt from our rules. Okay? Now, some people like to get a document from the county that says this subdivision is indeed exempt from the rules that are at play here. And that is the exempt subdivision review process. If I want the county to bless my exempt subdivision, I may come in and ask staff to give me a subdivision exemption certificate, okay, that I may file with my plat. I might do that because the bank needs it. I might do it to protect my interests with a business partner. I might do it as part of an estate. And so that's a process that's out there. It is a courtesy review. The county may not require somebody who's seeking a subdivision that's exempt from your subdivision rules to undergo this process, okay? And that's a mistake that a lot of local governments make. You can provide this service, and it's something that you can do as a courtesy. You can't mandate it. If I want to do an exempt subdivision and record it as a deed at the property assessor's office, I can do it, and there's nothing the county can do to stop me, okay? Because the law protects me because it's an exempt subdivision. So, understanding that that's a courtesy review and it's something that you make available for somebody if they want it, is important to be clear about, and that's why I call it out to you now. There are lots of county governments who think that you can mandate an exempt plat, okay? Oh, well, we're going to make you record this plat that says you're exempt. No, can't do that. The state says that's not a requirement. Okay. Family subdivision. I'm calling it a transfer plat. I don't love the name, but if you want to change the name, we can do that. But some people call it a family subdivision. Sometimes it's the word family has some connotations to it, so I'm suggesting we use the word transfer plat. That is the shifting of one or two or 4 lots or whatever from one member of an immediate family to another member. So grandfather to grandchild, or father to offspring, or brother to brother, sister to sister, etc. So direct family can transfer, 1 or 2 lots to a direct family member, exempt from a lot of the rules that we would normally subject a subdivision to, okay, like dedication of open space and construction of roads and some other things that come into the subdivision process. These family subdivisions are protected from that. Okay, so we are creating this family subdivision process. I think it's something that you have now, but we wanted to be clear that it's this process, it follows this is who decides it, this is how it works. The expedited subdivision, which I guess is the third row down. This was something that the General Assembly approved a few years ago. It's very troubling because it involves the ability to divide 5 acres or more into up to 3 lots. And it is categorically exempted from all of your requirements but the requirement to file a plat, okay? Some people think that the word expedited means it has to be done quickly. No, the expedited part is we're not going to allow local governments to subject this subdivision to dedication requirements, impact fees, construction of streets or public facilities. So these expedited subdivisions are special subdivisions. They are for small scale types of lot creation. There's some limitations on what can happen as an expedited subdivision. Yes, they need to be reviewed administratively, but the expedited part isn't so much about speed, it's rather about skipping some of the things that you might apply to a preliminary plat, right? So it's important that you recognize that this thing called an expedited subdivision exists, and that you need to recognize it, and that the things that you can require as a part of it are somewhat limited, all right? Next is the minor subdivision procedure. You guys are familiar with those, right? I want to divide, I want to create 2 lots, right? And there's no roads, and there's no water, no sewer, and this is something that's done administratively. It's easy. It's just I want to create 2 lots, all right? That's a minor subdivision. We would suggest that process be carried forward, but that you broaden it to 4 lots. Okay, so basically I could create up to 4 lots through the minor subdivision review procedure, all right? Now, we've made some changes to access, and we've made some changes, or we're suggesting some changes, to a couple of the other design provisions that I'll get to in a minute that help protect the county's interest from bad subdivisions, all right? So people sometimes come in under the guise of a minor subdivision and create lots that are weird and funky, and it's really hard to extend the road system, it's really hard to extend utilities. It makes it a real challenge for the county over time, right? So we do want to add some protection to our rules, but also recognize that, a minor subdivision could potentially be up to 4 lots. What, you have feelings about that? We're good? Okay, everybody? Okay. Final plat review authority. You guys, you know this, I know you do, are now responsible for reviewing final plats, right? Is it something you do a lot of or a little of, or how do people feel about that? Here's the thing. Go ahead. A final plat is a very, very simple process, and there's one decision that you have to make. And the decision is, did the development that got built match what we approved as a preliminary plat? That is it. That is the only decision associated with a final plat. Does what got built match what we approved? All right? That is the definition of a ministerial decision-making process. You either match it or you don't. There's no, I don't know if I want to approve this, if this is the right subdivision in the right place, or I don't think that lot totally matches. That's wholly inappropriate as part of a final plat review. It's very much a cut and dry, black or white kind of a decision. We would suggest that the county consider allowing staff to make those decisions, okay? Because there's no reason to tie up your time, right? There's no reason to tie up the applicant's time or the applicant's money in making a decision, does the development that got built match what we approved? Okay, so we're suggesting obviously open for discussion, whether or not that review process could be properly delegated to your staff, your professional level staff. Your subdivision regulation designates the Board of County Commissioners as the review authority for subdivision variances. So, that is something that can be done. Generally speaking, the 160D changes recognize the Board of Adjustment as the decision maker on a variance application, not the elected officials. And there's a wide number of reasons why that is so. All right, but we would suggest that variances to subdivision regulations be reviewed and decided by the Board of Adjustment in the variance procedure instead of the elected officials. And if you're dying to know why I'm making those suggestions, I will tell you. If you're not, then we'll move on to the next.
I'm dying.
You're dying to know. Okay. So a variance is a quasi-judicial procedure, okay? And a quasi-judicial procedure has very, very tight boundaries around it, all right? It's got to be subject to a public hearing, okay, that's properly noticed. You've got to have an evidentiary public hearing, okay, which means that people can show up, provide testimony, provide evidence, have an opportunity to cross-examine. It's very, very straightforward and legal in nature. Ex parte communication is not permitted. You cannot talk about the case outside of the hearing. That's an ex parte communication, and it's against the law. It violates the applicant's right to due process, okay? So you can't do that. Elected officials live and breathe to talk to their constituency, to have conversations with people about applications, whether they're sitting at the dais or they're at the grocery store, all right? So it's very, very difficult sometimes, in some places, for elected officials to understand the rules of the evidentiary hearing process, which are sacrosanct and can't be changed. You need to follow them to protect yourself from lawsuit, right? If you violate an evidentiary hearing procedure and somebody calls you out on it, even if you made the right decision, you'll still lose in court. And now, under 160D, the judge has to give damages to the appellant. It used to be, you get your approval, go on down the road, no damages. Now, that's gone. Judges have to approve damages, okay? So not only will you lose on a silly thing like procedure, you get to pay money. You get to pay for the attorney, and you don't even get a choice. The judge has to award it, okay?
I'm resigning.
Again, that's a quasi-judicial procedure. There is a place for them. One of the great things about quasi-judicial proceedings is you can apply discretion. You can make a determination, does this application comply with our adopted policy guidance? Is this development consistent with what's around it? Okay, that's very much a gray area kind of a decision to make, all right? And in the quasi-judicial procedure, you can do that. You can make those kinds of decisions. In a ministerial situation, does it comply with the codified standards or not? You're not allowed that kind of discretion. That's not appropriate, right? You either meet the standards or you don't. We don't talk about whether our consistency or meets the spirit and intent. That's not appropriate in a ministerial kind of a decision. So that's why I would suggest the Board of Adjustment handle the variance procedure, because that's a body that is assumedly more familiar with the quasi-judicial proceeding, is more familiar with the evidentiary process of findings of fact, conclusions of law, limitation on ex parte communication, proper evidentiary procedure, etc. That's part and parcel of the Board of Adjustment, and those things are antithetical to good elected official service, right? These guys are supposed to be having conversations among themselves, having conversations with the applicant. And one other thing, I don't know if you knew this or not, but in the middle of a quasi-judicial procedure, there's only what is presented to you at the hearing may you consider. You cannot consider a recommendation from another body, right? It didn't happen during the public hearing. You cannot consider what your neighbor told you last week, okay? That's outside of your realm of consideration in an evidentiary process and quasi-judicial proceeding. It's perfectly fine for legislative activity, like a rezoning or something like that. In fact, it's appropriate, but it's not appropriate in a quasi-judicial setting. So that's why. Sorry for the long explanation. We've put the Superior Court in as an appellate authority whenever anybody wants to appeal in a decision on a subdivision, okay? Generally speaking, that decision needs to go to Superior Court, okay? And the Superior Court, I'm not even going to throw the Latin words at you, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that decisions on subdivisions generally go to Superior Court, and 160D is very clear about that. How Superior Court handles that decision depends on your review process. We don't need to cover that now unless you want to. I am suggesting simple cross-references to text amendments and variances and handling those inside the zoning chapter instead of listing them here and the zoning chapter, okay? Right now, your current regulation, your subdivision regulations, has information in there about the text amendment process, which is not necessary. You don't need to do that. You can just cross-reference your zoning chapter. Same for variances. Finally, your subdivision article includes information about plan development provisions. And I don't want to go too deep into this because this is something we'll consider in the zoning part of our discussion, but I'll just say that plan development, as the county currently considers it, is a use-based decision-making process. A plan development is a use. It's not necessarily a subdivision. It might include a subdivision, but it is not a subdivision. It's a use. By the way, I don't think it should be a use. I think it should be a district, but we'll come to that in a minute. The point is, you don't need standards for uses in your subdivision regulation. Your subdivision regulation is about the division of land. That's it. It doesn't matter what use is. Okay? Important table. Questions? This table is important, but it's not as important. I put this in here because, frankly, I was starting to get a little confused and thought it might be helpful to set down for you, for a reader, for anyone, the 6 different kinds of subdivision applications that are inside this document, okay? So what are they? What are the characteristics associated with them? And what procedure do we follow to establish them? So I put this table in here. You could keep it in if you wanted to. Take 5? How about we finish this slide and then we'll take 5? Thank you. You could keep this table in, or you could take it out and just have it be a handout if you wanted to. Basically, it identifies that exempt subdivisions are courtesy only. The transfer subdivision is the family subdivision I mentioned. The expedited subdivision required by state law. We're suggesting minor subdivisions go from 2 to 4 lots. The preliminary plat is your current process, not changed. Final plat, that the review decision is made by the subdivision administrator. This table is on pages 152, 13, and 14. I have a bunch of, there's a footnote on page 152, 13, and I have not had a chance to talk with staff about it yet. And I'm going to take my lead from you about whether or not we should talk about the preliminary plat process being legislative or quasi-judicial. It can be either one. There are real pros and real cons associated with each. Right now, today, your preliminary plat process is legislative in nature, which is great and works great. You can keep it that way, or you can change it to quasi-judicial. What are the pros and what are the cons? The pros of going to a quasi-judicial procedure are that you can apply discretion. You can talk about whether or not this subdivision is consistent with the surroundings or is consistent with the adopted policy guidance. That's something that you can do if your subdivision process is quasi-judicial in nature. If it is legislative in nature, like yours is right now, you may not make those kinds of determinations. That is inappropriate. If the land that proposed for subdivision meets the standards in the book, you must approve it. You don't have a choice. If it meets the standards, it must be approved. If you use the quasi-judicial process, you can decide, does this meet the standards? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I can apply conditions of approval to help it meet the standards in a better way, all right? So that's the pro for the quasi-judicial process. What's the con? The con is you got to have a public hearing, you got to follow the evidentiary process, and there is no need for planning board to be involved in the process because you can't listen to their recommendation anyway. It was delivered to you outside of the public hearing, right? So that public hearing for consideration of that subdivision as a quasi-judicial decision, the only thing you can rely on is the evidence and testimony that's presented at that hearing, okay? So that's a big con, right? Because you pay these guys to give you their best notions about the development. Is this appropriate? Does it make sense? How do we feel about this? Is it good? In the quasi-judicial procedure, you're not even, they can weigh in. You're not allowed to use their recommendation in your decision-making process as part of quasi-judicial, which is crazy, but that's the way that it is. So I don't know if you guys have a strong feeling about it. We talked about the reasons associated with quasi-judicial. There's some good, there's some bad. It's legislative now. You could kick the can down the road and we can take this up in the hearing process, or we can talk about it now, or we can talk about it after the break if you want to. Do you guys have a feel about whether or not you want to keep going with the legislative process or switch to the quasi-judicial?
The legislative process seems to be a lot simpler.
It is simple, and it allows you guys to be involved in the process, which are good things. The downside is you have less wiggle room in your deliberations. That's kind of the downside associated with it.
Basically, you can't set conditions, I guess.
Right, you may not have conditions of approval in a legislative subdivision case. It either meets the standards or it doesn't.
I think the legislative is more simple. We got a lot going on right now. We always can go back and tweak it.
Absolutely.
Or do an amendment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not to throw needless complexity into it, but I'm going to anyway, because you're getting to know me, you're getting to know. You can decide, hey, some subdivisions, maybe in this district or this number of lots or in this part of the county, we're going to make quasi-judicial, but in other parts of the county or smaller or in other areas, we're going to let them be legislative. So you can further tweak this and make decisions about, okay, those subdivisions in that part of the county, they're quasi-judicial. Those subdivisions over there, they're legislative. So you do have that authority. So you can bring some nuance into this.
We're gonna pick and choose. That don't seem fair. I'm sorry, that just don't seem fair.
It has to be done in accordance with your comprehensive plan. That's important. But, let's say for the sake of argument that you decide this particular location in Gates County is really, really environmentally sensitive, and it's got, this particular kind of animal habitat or this particular kind of plant or this particular kind of feature that we really want to protect, right, for whatever reason. So what we're going to do to make sure that that's a reality is we're going to make subdivisions over a certain size quasi-judicial within this portion of the county as identified in the comprehensive plan. Is that legitimate? Yes. Is it legal? Yes, you can do that. Is it a good idea? That's a different question.
Let me ask this though, if we were to do something like that, or even change it to the quasi-judicial, that may not be consistent with our land use plan, is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct.
Maybe that, for this point, maybe we stay legislative, would that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So then it could be something to revisit later.
Right, right. I would say, if that's something that you are interested in and want to explore, then you should take a little bit more time.
Right.
And we should get a little bit more serious about, okay, what are the pros and cons, and what does this mean, and how will things change if we decided to use this quasi-judicial procedure, which, again, we're not using today. And I'm not, you're not gonna hurt my feelings if you say, get that thing out of here. I'm with you there. Some people use it, and some people don't, and, you know, most people don't, but it is out there available for your use if you wanted it, so I
I
just,
can see where it would be beneficial.
Right.
yeah, yeah.
I do too, and I respect,
Yeah.
you know, on that totally. I just think definitely, just not too long ago recently, adopted becomes our land use plan.
Mhm.
That we definitely need to explore that, and I do agree that we can see it as beneficial as well, but I think.
I think if we would have had that
I
a
know.
year ago, we could have avoided a whole lot of situations in the county.
Yeah. Well, you know, the thinking on this is evolving, right? It wasn't that long ago I sat in front of groups like yours and said, you can't use quasi-judicial decision-making during a subdivision, all right? It was sort of off the table. And 160D has refined that and said, well, this is actually okay, guys, if you want to do it, as long as you follow all the rules, right? And so, you know, folks like yourselves, we're trying to find our way in this new 160D world that we've got. So I didn't want you to think that Chatty's holding out on me. He's not telling me the truth. There's more information. So that's it. You guys want to take 5? This is a great time to do it.
Bright sun coming in here. Hitting on that glass. Well, you get back, move back to the front.
sure that we've got some direction on. So, this slide shows application processing, section 152.211. This is a new section that we would like to include in the regulation. And basically what this does is it sets down the standard process for consideration of applications. So any subdivision application that comes in to Gates County will follow the steps laid out in this section. All right, so this is the standardized, uniform process that you were mentioning earlier. This is what we will follow. It takes applicants from the pre-application conference through the filing, through staff review, notification, public meetings versus hearings, conditions of approval, if and when they're applied, written notice of decision, how things are modified, and then finally continuance and withdrawal. Okay, so say it once instead of repeating it for every single procedure, which is how it's done now. All right? I just wanted to include this slide so that you were sure you have a section in your current regulation that sets down the application requirements, the things that you have to include in a particular kind of a plat, whether it's a minor subdivision plat or a preliminary plat or a final plat. I just wanted you to know that we have updated that for these different kinds of subdivisions. So that's the purpose of this slide. We were very conscious of being comprehensive in our updates, okay? I mentioned earlier that improvement guarantees, something that you have today, just need a little bit of tweaking. So I'm going to hit the three highlights for you on improvement guarantees. And again, these are used when an applicant for a subdivision wants to either pull a building permit or sell lots, but hasn't yet completed all of the requirements, okay? And this is a common practice for people. Generally speaking, local governments will allow subdivision applicants to post a bond to protect the county's interest in making sure that all of the requirements, the required infrastructure, et cetera, get installed. Okay? These, you have improvement guarantees in your current code, you just need to update them for at least three things. One, form. What form does the performance guarantee take? Your current regulation sets down a variety of different forms that are allowable, okay, which is typical, right? So like a bond or a letter of credit or cash, these sorts of things. And that's all appropriate and carried forward. What is missing from your regulation is the fact that now, under 160D, the applicant gets to decide the form, not the county. Okay, so the applicant gets to decide, I'm going to post a bond, I'm going to give you a letter of credit, I'm going to write you a check. That is at the applicant's discretion. Further, the applicant can bunch these. So let's say there are multiple elements of their development that need to be bonded. In the past, local governments could require separate performance guarantees for that. That's gone, and you may now, the applicant may consolidate or bunch their performance guarantees into a single guarantee. So that's one change. Another is the term. Performance guarantees?
Question on that.
Yes.
Suppose it's gonna be a long-term development. And he decides at the start that he's gonna bunch it all together to start with, and then it's gonna take him 10 years to get the whole thing developed.
Right. So here's the thing on performance bonds, and I'll try to capture for you what has happened. What has happened is that the General Assembly has made performance bonds more sympathetic to the subdivider. They have been altered to be easier for the subdivider to get and structure. Okay, so they have taken authority away from local governments through 160D as it pertains to performance guarantees. Here's the thing. Approval, acceptance of a performance guarantee is at your discretion, okay? So if the applicant says, hey, I'd really like to post this bond, and here's, my letter of credit, and I want to do it for, 10 years and blah, 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 you can simply say, no, thank you. you'll need to complete the requirements before we issue you a building permit. And that's your lever, that's your control. Okay, so that is still in place. Cross our fingers that that remains in place. Local governments have had a tough slog over the last decade. The General Assembly may at some point in the future take away that ability, but for now, the local government can simply say, we're not accepting performance guarantees. We're not accepting performance guarantees from you. We might accept it from them, but not from you, and that's at our discretion. So you do have that lever. Finally, so I mentioned term. Your current regulation says 18 months. It's 1 year, okay? 1 year is the maximum term for performance guarantee. An applicant can extend that, but that's at their discretion, not yours, okay? Finally, and this is very important, you have provisions in your current regulation about a defects guarantee, all right? So that's you're going to warranty this street or this water line or this piece of infrastructure. After we accept it, you're going to give us a 1-year warranty on it to make sure that it operates as intended, okay? That's been taken away from us. Local governments can no longer require maintenance warranties or defect guarantees for most forms of infrastructure, okay? You may still require one for stormwater and for soil erosion sedimentation, but for other features like water, sewer, roads, streetlights, sidewalks, no more defect warranties. So I've removed that from this section, okay? So some subtle changes. Your standards are in pretty good shape. We just needed to make some tweaks for compliance with state law. The important thing to remember is you don't have to approve it. You can simply say, no. Okay. 2 more chapters here, or articles, Article 152.3, the standards, and Article 152.4, infrastructure. These are the basic nuts and bolts rules about how subdivisions are configured. Most of this has been carried forward. I have made some subtle changes to this for your consideration. First is I've included some requirements for monuments, okay? And monuments are the pins that they set at the corners of lots so that allows subsequent surveyors to find the property lines. Just needed a little bit of coming into the modern age with those. So I've included some monumenting standards in your provision. I've also added some owners association requirements. So if you're going to have common land that's either open space or private streets or some other kind of shared infrastructure, you must have an owners association. And these rules specify how it's formed, what its responsibilities are, and the requirements for transfer of maintenance responsibility from the developer to the homeowner association. The sole purpose for those homeowner association changes are to protect the county from homeowners associations who fail to collect dues, have their infrastructure become degraded, and then come to the county asking for you to accept it and maintain it, right? So we're seeking to avoid that kind of problem with these standards, okay? Infrastructure. This is the streets. I'm sorry, please.
Wait a minute. Going back to that, saying that with the homeowners association, and things get in a state of disrepair, and the county's not gonna take it over.
Mm-hmm.
But does the county have any recourse in which they can come in there and say, you need to upgrade this? You need to bring it up to standards?
Right. That is an excellent question. And I think the answer is it depends on the kind of infrastructure. If it's drainage related or stormwater related, then absolutely positively, yes, you can come in and specify this is substandard and needs to be improved or upgraded, okay? Yes. If it's private common open space that's recreation land, okay? If it's kept mowed or it's kept clear and there's not a problem with nuisance vegetation or rodents or the other kinds of minimum housing kinds of things that you see, then you really don't have much, you don't have a whole lot of latitude to require them to upgrade that. If they don't keep it mowed or it becomes a health hazard, whether that's, mosquitoes or rodents or something, or snakes or whatever, yes, you can compel them, but that's under the nuisance doctrine, not the homeowner association doctrine. Finally, streets. I am making some suggestions for changes to street standards to clarify that even private streets need to be built to state street standards, okay? So your official position as a county is that street needs to be built and maintained so that NCDOT could step in and assume that street at any time once the minimum residential density is established on the street. Up until that point, it is the developer's responsibility or the homeowner's responsibility, as the case may be, to manage until that residential density meets the minimum tipping point for NCDOT to step in and take the street. Okay, so you're protected in streets. Okay, does that answer your question?
Protected to a point, but not really.
Counties are at a disadvantage on the streets, and the loss of the defects guarantee makes it worse. And I wish I had better news for you on the street standpoint, but I don't. There's really not a lot of protection for counties for streets that are built that are subpar. You're not really involved in that side of it. Counties aren't in the business of providing streets, right? That's not part of your reason for being. And so NCDOT has more latitude when it comes to counties than they do with cities or towns. And so you're sort of at a disadvantage there. I would encourage you to, one, have some very clear standards about when streets are required, right? And I'm going to talk about what I'm suggesting you consider in a second. So have some clear standards about when streets are required. Two, require that private streets be built to public street standards. And three, maintain in your homeowners association the clarity that you already have about the fact that it is their responsibility to maintain that street until NCDOT takes it over. So you have one of the legs of the stool covered already. We just need to pick up the other two. Okay? So I mentioned a second ago being sure that you clarify about when driveways and so forth, when a street is required. And I would suggest to you, and you need to consider this and think about it, that you allow up to 4 lots to be accessed by a quote-unquote private access way that doesn't meet a street standard, okay? It's not a coincidence that marries up to your minor subdivision and the expedited subdivision rules. That's not a coincidence. That was very intentional, okay? So a minor subdivision could be built without building a street, okay? After 4 lots, 5 lots or more, the street has to be a public street or a private street. It really doesn't matter which is which, because private streets have to be built to public standards, okay? So essentially, and this is significant for the county, after you pass 4 lots, it's necessary for you to put in a street. That street could be private if you wish it to be, or it could be public if you wish it to be. But that after 4 lots, that needs to be a street. And even if it is a private street, it still has to meet public street standards. You're gonna hear some pushback on that. You're gonna get some applicants who are not happy about that because that's going to cost more money. But it protects you, and it protects the subsequent landowners who buy property on that access way from loss of an easement or lack of maintenance, or the inability for emergency vehicles to get down there because the access way wasn't built according to the specifications. So in the long-term interest, this is a protective standard, but it is something that you need to look at, and it's in the streets section, in section 152.402. Be sure to have a look at it so that you understand it, okay? It's not uncommon. This kind of rule is very typical, but it's definitely something that needs clarification in your current reg, okay? I have also added in 152.4 some more clarification about potable water and wastewater. Mostly that some service has to be present, okay? If it's a well, that's okay, no problem. If it's public water, okay, great, whatever. You just have to have something, right? I'm gonna go down to 7-Eleven and buy, big bottles of water. That's not going to be sufficient, right? Same with wastewater. You know, it needs to be a septic system, or it needs to be a community system for your neighborhood, or it needs to be part of a public system. It needs to be one of those. And if it is one of those, you'll have to meet the required standards, whether that's environmental health, whether that's the county water system, whether that's some municipality who's running the line out there, whatever it is, you need to meet those requirements, okay? So I've added that kind of information in the potable water and wastewater sections of infrastructure. If you look down the screen on the right-hand side, you see two things that are sort of grayed out. And that's because we still need to talk about that. Need to talk with staff about it. And that is whether or not we want to include standards for sidewalks and greenways, okay? Sidewalks are expensive. They're fairly urban in nature. Maybe that's not appropriate for the county. Maybe it is. Maybe it's appropriate in some areas. So that's something that we need to, I just need to get a little bit more information. Do you need these standards or not? If you don't, then, you know, that can just be a placeholder, or we can just take it out, whatever, no problem. Greenways. They're all the rage. Everybody loves greenways. And there's a good reason why. They allow people to get from place to place on a bike or walking without a car. And people like greenways. You know, 30 years ago it was golf courses, right? Now it's greenways. People like greenways. Here is my soapbox speech on greenways. You need to have a plan in place that identifies on the ground where the greenway alignment is, okay? And then if somebody comes to you and says, I want to do a subdivision, and the greenway transects that property anywhere on the site, then they are responsible for dedicating the land for the greenway, constructing the greenway, and doing that as part of the development. That's the requirement, all right? But it hinges on the county's adopted policy guidance in place. Do not, you should not ever ad hoc make greenway requirements without a plan, okay? Because it's a jumbled system and it creates this legal exposure that you simply don't need. So you may have a greenway plan and I don't know about it. If you don't have a greenway plan and you want to have greenways, get a plan, okay?
I think we'd like to at least have a placeholder, because we may have a strategic plan eventually to include that.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. You have open space set-aside requirements, carry those forward. And open space, you know, if somebody does a greenway, well, that's open space, you know, so you meet that requirement. Awesome. We just need some rules about, okay, we want greenways in this area, and that's done so that somebody doesn't say, oh, well, you know, that's not fair. You just made me, you want me to put this greenway in, but you don't have any piece of paper that says there's going to be a greenway here. You're just messing with me. So we want to avoid that kind of debate. Okay. Couple more slides on subdivisions, and then we'll talk about the fun stuff. Enforcement. This needed to be completely overhauled. You have 2 paragraphs on enforcement of your subdivision regulation. It is important. You must clarify the process that the county will use for investigation of a violation, how a notice of violation will be sent, and how a notice of violation must be responded to by a violator. And you must make it clear what happens if the violator doesn't respond to your citation, okay? So that all has got to be codified under 160D. It's not really now. There's a couple of sentences, but it's far too vague and needs to be clearer. We need to clarify what constitutes violations, who's responsible, and it's not just the owner, right? It could be the subdivider, it could be the architect, it could be the engineer. There's a variety of different people who might be responsible for a violation, so we need to set that down and be clear about it. We need to identify the range of remedies that are available to the county, and there are a ton of them, right? Not just, here's your citation, notice of violation, and your assessment, your fine. There's stop work orders, there's permit revocation, there's injunction by the courts, there's orders of abatement, there's equitable relief. There's a ton of different things that are out there, but if they're not in your ordinance, it's not clear that you can avail yourselves of them. So they need to be inserted into your ordinance, all right? So that is it on the enforcement regulation, and kind of brings us to the end of the subdivision chapter altogether. I know we've kind of blistered through this. There's a lot there, but you know, I feel like the changes that we're suggesting bring you into the modern age. It's probably a little bit more detail than we thought we were going to get into way back in March, but maybe that's not a bad thing. And I'm pretty comfortable that what you've got is well, it's not that I'm comfortable. I know what you've got in this draft is legally defensible. It's just whether or not you wish to include it, or if there's any tweaks that you guys want to make along the way, okay? Any questions on subdivision? Okay. Zoning. My favorite subject. So, you have subdivision, which is how do I divide land, right? Zoning is how do I use my land, right? What are the allowable uses? How will I configure my development? That's what zoning deals with. I just want to give you guys an overview. We're still in the process of drafting this chapter. Okay, so I'm still working on this. I'm going to get it done in March, but we thought we'd come in and talk to you guys about some of these concepts so that you kind of get a feel for where we're headed. Like subdivision, we're suggesting changing the sequence, making it a little bit more intuitive. We've gone from 11 articles to 8, grouping material by topic, overhauling the procedures, as we did with the subdivision procedures, and several new standards. And I want to focus on some of those procedures and standards now, okay? So, I mentioned before, we're thinking about constituting a technical review committee. That is a group of professionals. It's the county staff, but it might also be, you know, members from state agencies, members from utilities, whether they're public or private, et cetera, who get together and assist with reviews, not just of subdivisions, but also of site plans, okay? So you might decide that you want to use your technical review committee to conduct pre-application conferences, decide minor subdivisions, and decide site plans, or not. You know, that's open for you, but some places ask their TRC to review site plans. We need to update your procedures for 160D compliance. Remember those things I told you where we had the application filing and the completeness and the staff action and the public hearings and written notice of decision and all that stuff? We got to put that stuff in your zoning chapter too. So that needs to be there. We're suggesting allowing, and this is something for you guys to think about a little bit, allowing the expedited subdivisions and the family subdivisions in the A1 district. Right now, unless I misread things, you may not do a residential subdivision in A1, okay? I think that might be something that you want to explore, the possibility of allowing these family subdivisions in A1 based on some of the information that I was given when I talked to people. So that's something, you know, again, we haven't drafted this yet. I'm putting it out there for you guys to think about. Do we allow these de minimis, small residential subdivisions in A1 or not? I mentioned that we integrated the manufactured homes. Remember Chapter 151 in your current code? We're bringing that into the zoning ordinance, just citing that for you again, and that we've folded in the development standards from Chapter 154 and what we've done with the Agricultural Advisory Board and the Voluntary Agricultural District. Remember that? So I'm just setting down that marker for you. Want to suggest that we consider planned development as a district, not a use type. Right now, the county allows planned unit development. It's something that you can do. I think it requires a special use permit. Okay. We talked a lot about the quasi-judicial procedure and the ups and downs associated with that. If you consider handling planned unit development as a district, you get to make those decisions in the legislative session, okay? In the legislative realm, right? Which means that your elected officials have a lot more discretion. They can say, well, Mr. Meadows, I see that you've given me this plan development application, and I see that it meets all the standards in our ordinance, but I'm not sure it's consistent with our policies. I'm not sure it's consistent with this area, so I'm going to vote for denial. And that's wholly within their discretion in the legislative setting, right? They have the maximum authority to make decisions with the minimal amount of requirement to be bound by the rule of law, all right? It is their discretion that they can exercise in changing the zoning map. So they have a lot more flexibility. Why is that a good thing? Plan development, the whole reason behind plan development is to create flexibility, is to give an applicant an opportunity to bring a development that may not comply with all of the standards in the ordinance, but, and it's a big one, but it must have a quality of development that exceeds what would result from a strict application of the standard. Okay? In other words, what you build must be better than what we'd get if we just followed our rules. Okay? And you can make the applicant prove to you the ways in which that plan development is better than a strict application of the standard under this plan development district approach. So I would suggest to you that you not use the quasi-judicial special use permit procedure to establish a plan development. Rather, that we create this thing called a plan development district and use the map amendment process, subject to a master plan, subject to, full disclosure by the applicant about what's being proposed, as our mechanism for establishing plan developments. Okay? That is very much the modern way that things are done. Most local governments are not using quasi-judicial process for plan development. It's simply too legally dangerous. Okay? Okay. Okay, so you guys have a use table, which is great. You're ahead of the game. A lot of places don't even have a use table, right? A big table with all the uses in the districts where it's allowed, and whether it's a permitted use or special use or whatever. You've got that, and that's great. What you don't have is a use classification system. In other words, you are bound by the uses that you list, right? And there's no procedure, no way for you as a jurisdiction to make a determination about an unlisted use. If somebody wants to propose a fox pen, you don't have a listed use called a fox pen, okay? Now, if you look at your current regulation, it says if the use isn't listed, it's not allowed, right? So you could hang your hat on that, on fox pens. But darn it, there's that whole Byrd v. Franklin County case out of the North Carolina Court of Appeals that says just because you don't list a use doesn't mean you get to prohibit it. You've got to have a system in place that allows an analysis of that unlisted use and an affirmative determination about whether or not that use that's proposed, even though not listed, is or is not similar to another listed use and therefore is or is not allowable. Okay, so you've got to create this use classification system for the determination of unlisted uses. Got to have it. Okay, it's not 160D, it's NC Court of Appeals. All right. Also, suggesting you guys add a list of prohibited uses. This is uses that are prohibited everywhere in the county. Now, you might decide you wanted to prohibit a particular kind of a use, like a fox pen, everywhere in the county, all districts, not allowed, right? Some places do this for landfills, for billboards, for medical waste, for nuclear reactors, a variety of other kinds of issues or land use types are typically prohibited throughout the county. There's some that people would like to prohibit, but that they can't, okay? Sexually oriented businesses are constitutionally protected. Confined animal feedlots are protected under the North Carolina statutes. Billboards are protected under federal law along highways. But you do have the ability to add some prohibited uses. It may be that you can prohibit fox pens. That requires a little bit of research, and I think we're going to look into that, whether or not that's something that's permissible under the agritourism exemption. So we'll look into that. But bottom line, you need this use classification system, and you need to identify some prohibited uses, okay? We need to clarify the rules for accessory and temporary uses. They're all jammed together, and it's really confusing, okay? And why does that matter? Well, accessory uses are things that happen on a site that has a principal use, okay? But you gotta have a principal use in place first before you can establish an accessory use, all right? So I don't get to buy a piece of property and then put on a garage, and that garage is my use, because that's an accessory to whatever would be happening on there. When I say garage, I mean like a residential garage, not like a auto parts place, okay? You got to have the principal use in place first, and it's kind of muddled in your current regulation about how that process works, and it needs to be clarified, right? So we will do that. I mentioned at the head of the discussion, you guys just did a text amendment for temporary housing, right? So we need a set of standards for temporary uses, okay? Where can I have them? Where can I not have them? What's the process? Do I get a permit? How does that work? Clarity for the applicant, clarity for your staff. There's a handful of other federal laws we need to address. There's a crazy acronym here called RLUIPA. That is the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. And essentially what it says is that you must treat churches, schools, and fraternal organizations the same in terms of the districts where they're allowed and the procedure for the establishment, okay? And that's done because the lines are blurry between what is a religious use versus a school versus a fraternal organization. It's very, very difficult to distinguish between those, okay? And so therefore the federal government said, we can't create a bright line between what's a religious facility and a school, right? I might be a school that teaches religious stuff. I might have a church that has a school, right? I might have a fraternal organization that is actually religious in nature. And so what the federal government said was, we're not going to do a bright line between these uses anymore. We're just going to say you have to treat all three of them the same, okay? And your regulations do not do that now, all right? So that needs to be done. That is a federal law that we need to address. Telecommunications, I talked about the Tax Relief Act of 2017 and how we need to be in compliance with that. Signs. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and this is going to blow your mind, but I'm going to share it with you. There was a case that came through the Supreme Court. It's called Reed versus Gilbert, and it deals with signs. And the court said, I know this is going to sound crazy, but the court said, if you have to read the sign to decide what rules apply to the sign, then your sign regulation is unconstitutional and can be struck down. And crazy as it sounds, that is the state of the law here in this country. So just like every local government in North Carolina has to change its rules for compliance with 160D, every local government in the United States has to change its rules for signs for consistency with the Reed ruling. Okay? Your sign standards are in fair shape, but there's still some problems. If you have sign rules that regulate based on whether you're commercial or non-commercial, all right, that's an unconstitutional sign rule. If you have sign regulations that recognize sign types for one type of use, like a gas station or a church or a restaurant, then that is a content-based unconstitutional sign standard that has to be changed. Okay? If you have sign standards that recognize commercial speech from non-commercial speech, that's content-based and it's unconstitutional. So we can change that, and we will. You can still regulate time, place, manner, illumination, number of signs, size of the sign, height of the sign, whether or not it's landscaped. All of that stuff you can still regulate. Okay, but what you may not do anymore is say, this type of use gets that kind of sign, this type of use gets that kind of sign. Can't do that anymore. Nor can you say, that kind of sign is non-commercial in nature, therefore it can stay longer or be bigger or be taller or be there in the first place, where a commercial sign couldn't. Can't do that anymore, okay? Also, you guys don't have this, but there's a lot of standards out there for color and size of the font and that sort of thing, which is questionable about whether or not you can regulate those things. That's not part of y'all's regulation, so we don't have to worry about that. But generally speaking, we have some federal changes to signs that we need to make, okay? Nothing major, but there are some adjustments. Finally, a couple more suggestions for you guys. One, you have no parking lot configuration standards, okay? How wide are the aisles? Do I have to put wheel stops in? How do I handle parking lot drainage? Are there throat lane distances that need to be maintained? There are no parking lot configuration standards on your books. I think you should have some. Do you guys have an opinion?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, as far as having the regulations for a parking lot, if it's going to be for public use, you should have it set so cars can get in and know what they're supposed to do.
I agree. Interestingly, your current regulation calls them off-street parking and loading standards, but you have no standards for loading. So I would suggest you get some. Any problem with that? Okay. Another big change. Right now, so perimeter landscape buffer standards are handled through your use regulations. So part of your zoning chapter sets down a bunch of rules for different kinds of uses. And buried within those are the requirements for additional landscaping that you have to put in, okay? I would suggest to you that there's a better way for us to do that, that we establish some rudimentary perimeter landscape buffer requirements for non-residential uses when they butt up against a residential use, okay? And possibly some requirements for residential subdivisions when they butt up against farmland for a buffer to be installed. And move those out of the use standards and handle it as a development standard. One of the biggest reasons why that should be done is your buffering standards as they exist right now are use-based instead of district-based. And if the use changes, I may have to put in additional landscaping, right? But my site was built the way my site was built, and I may not be able to put in additional landscaping because I followed the rules that were in place at the time. All right, and I put my parking spaces in that I had to put in. I was following the rules. Somebody else comes along later. They've got a use that requires more landscaping than I had to put in. They have nowhere to put it. Now what do? That's a big problem. And so we want to get away from that approach and into this development standard approach that's based on district instead of use type. Okay? Questions about that? Okay. So I wanted to be sure that you guys were comfortable that we were going to make some adjustments to the uses, this use classification system and the prohibited uses, that we were going to segment out and identify some more accessory uses and some temporary uses, that we were going to adjust your sign standards for federal compliance, that we were going to add parking lot configuration and loading standards, and that we were going to pull your landscaping approach out of the use-based standards and create a more uniform approach for non-residential uses and possibly residential uses against farms going forward. Now, the reason I'm calling your attention to that is when we started down the road with this was like, we're going to make these technical adjustments. You know, we're going to do 160D and that's it. But then when we started looking at your regulation, we're like, well, you guys really are kind of behind on some other things, and we need to kind of get you guys up to the kind of minimum level for your jurisdiction. And so these would rise above the level of basic adjustments for 160D compliance into this realm of substantive change. And that's why I'm making a big deal about telling you about it so that you're not surprised when you see those in the zoning section.
Yeah, the off-street loading, is this going to be some regulations that would be feasible for a person to apply, or is it going to be something that would be way over someone's head that would be hard to use?
Right, so the loading stuff usually has 3 or 4 components to it, and those include the location on the building where it is, which is usually the side or the rear. It includes the access to it, which usually means you cannot drive through required parking spaces to get to your loading site. The dimensional configurations of the loading space itself, right? Its width, its length, the clearance of the loading space, and then finally, the fact that it's typically screened from residential development. Those are the basic parameters of off-street loading. Speaking for myself, I prefer an approach that says, if you have a non-residential use and you wish to provide loading, that's great. Here are the standards that you need to follow. If you are doing a residential use and you don't believe you need off-street loading, don't provide it, and then you don't have to worry about these standards, okay? So that puts the onus on the applicant for deciding, I need it, I don't need it, and if I need it, here are the rules that I have to follow. That's the approach I like to use. Some places actually say, okay, well, if you're going to do a non-residential building of this size, you have to have this many loading docks. It's not really that way anymore, you know? Like a big office building does not need a loading dock, right?
Yeah.
Or a small warehouse might need more than one dock. So it's not as simple as just a minimum number of loading spaces per gross square footage matter. There's more to it than that. And so I would suggest an approach that put that in the hands of the applicant.
Makes sense.
Okay. A couple more slides, guys. I think we're done. We will finish up drafting of Chapter 155 next month. We would like to, and again, I don't want to tread on Lisa's toes here. This is really in her wheelhouse, but we would like to conduct a public hearing, public meeting with you guys on the full Title 15 edits, maybe in April. If not in April, certainly in May. You guys need to provide a recommendation and a statement of consistency. Okay, that's a legal requirement on this. So we need to get that as part of the adoption process. We hope to go in front of the Board of Commissioners for their decision during a public hearing, either in May or June, depending upon what this body does. And then I will deliver the final document and the copies and everything to Lisa, before July 1st, which is sort of our deadline for these 160D changes. We need to have our books squared away by that date. Questions on the schedule? Any other comments? That's all I have. You guys have been great and soldiered through this material, even though it's like incredibly boring. But I surely do appreciate it. I would say if you have questions or comments, please forward those to Lisa. If something has come up that I haven't covered well, and you'd like to have more discussion about it, we can talk about a telephone conference or something like that, if that's something that you want to do. Glad to do that. And be on the lookout for this Chapter 155, sometime in March. And I sure do thank you.
Thank you.
You can go out the back, and the only reason you can't go, you can walk out, but you can get out the back. All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank y'all for hanging on. Is there any comments?
Anybody got any comments? Can everybody digest everything we've done today? Looks like we've got a lot of work to do coming up still. But anyway,
I think the bulk of it, it looks to me, was done. I mean, as far as getting the overview.
yeah, the
And
overview.
the big changes, I think Chad really covered those things today. I think that was a big thing to accomplish today. And it really opened up, I mean, does it seem, I know you're tired, but didn't it seem like it opened up to have a good understanding of what's coming
I see what's coming.
He did
You see what's coming?
I see what's coming.
What's coming?
And I've been looking at this for quite some time.
Right.
But is Gates County ready for it?
There you go.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean,
Because what I'm seeing, Lisa, is we're going from a rural agricultural to a urban place.
well, I
And
don't,
we-
I
and we-
think we've got some new rules, but I don't think we're gonna lose our agriculture. I do not think that'll happen. Thank you, Judge.
But Gates County, in my opinion, is nothing gonna be but a bedroom community for the next 50 years.
I hope not to lose that agricultural side, that farming side, but I don't feel that too intent, and I hope not, I hope no one feels that. But I do understand what you're saying, I mean, it's gonna change, it's gonna grow, I mean, I think that's something we're gonna have to probably.
But I know it's gonna change and it's gonna grow, but I think we need to have this in place.
Yes.
Because if we don't, we're gonna end up like we've been in the past, playing behind 8 ball. And that ain't good.
And I think, and just, all I can tell you is what I see, and there's, I think, moving on and just doing some improvements with what we've got, here, and looking ahead, will help us to do it in a fashion that is smart, and will give us some sort of grasp on it. It's not, some things you're gonna have your exceptions, you're gonna have some variances along the way, but I think having that plan is what's gonna be so important, and
I think we're smart to be 10 years ahead of the game.
I think so too.
You gotta look at the future, what's coming, and where are we gonna be at in 10 years,
That's right.
and how we gonna handle it, so.
But
I'd
even
like to
so,
say-
but even so,
Glad you said.
I don't think we're gonna be 10 years ahead of the game.
Now,
Because-
we're just catching up.
We're starting to catch up now. With this, we're just starting to catch up.
Yeah.
If you see what's taking place in the city of Suffolk over there, and everything that's in Suffolk that's going from northern Suffolk to now it's going down 58, it's going to Franklin. One day it's gonna jump across the line, and we're gonna be inundated.
But hopefully you're thinking ahead and you're not building it and letting it come before you're ready. That's all you can do.
That's what I want. That's what I want.
Hopefully you're,
That's what I want in place is infrastructure before it gets here.
that's right.
I do not want to be behind the 8 ball.
And still not forgetting where you come from.
That's right.
That's all I have to say. Thank you, Doug. Thank you for hanging in there. So you just have to, if there's any more comments?
I need a-
on our agenda?
I need a motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Got a motion? Got a second? Meeting's adjourned. Appreciate y'all coming out today.